Hey everyone, it's Jessie from b.a.r.e Flower Farm. Today I wanted to talk about a successful experiment that I had interplanting snapdragons with lilies in crates. Now in my last video where I did a May farm tour, I talked a little bit about this, but I wanted to spend some time in a video talking a little bit more about specifics and who might be interested in doing this. So let's first talk about my climate and why I did this. I live in New Jersey in zone 7A, and despite the higher zone number, we still live in a climate that gets pretty cold in the winter. I have tried to grow snaps outside overwintered from the fall, both covered and uncovered. If I do not cover them, they basically get demolished in our winters. And while there is still strong root growth, what ends up happening is they have very little tip growth and they're basically starting over again sometime in like late March, early April. So they're nowhere near blooming right now. Now, if I cover them, basically I can get blooms at this point. They would just be a bit shorter blooms, and we're gonna talk a little bit more about that. So for me, I am not great at covering, uncovering, especially when it gets to spring. I have a full-time job. It's just not possible for me to come outside and baby the snaps every single day. It's not like ranunculus, but at the same time, covering is just an extra piece of headache, especially if there's a snowstorm in the winter. So one of the things that I also was dealing with last year is thrips. Now, if you grow snapdragons, it's very likely that you also have dealt with thrips pressure. Thrips are coming out this time of year. So we are in late May. Thrips start coming out when it gets to be closer to summer-like temperatures. They are a more warm weather type of pest, like aphids are normally the first to come, then it's thrips. But the point is that thrips love snapdragons. They are a magnet. And if you open the throat of a snapdragon in like late June, early July here, it's gonna be covered in thrips. Last year, I had thrips on my snapdragons already by now for those that were growing outside. So snapdragons are one of my favorite flowers, and I decided not to grow them outside because of the thrips, but I wanted to see if I could still get snapdragons in the early spring without the worry of thrips. So this is where planting in a crate with lilies come in. I treat my lilies as annuals because I grow so many, it's kind of hard to see at the scale, but I've got a bunch of crates in the back. Point is, I grow a lot of lilies. I cannot perennialize thousands of lilies because I do not need thousands of lilies growing at the same time. But I start planting lilies around the same time that I start the snapdragons. So probably about like 25, 30 days after I start the snapdragons. And when I plant lilies at that time, I'm planting them indoors, which means that I am using a sterile mix. You don't want to be using things that are not sterile, especially if you're growing indoors, because you're going to be inviting pests to come in and there's not going to be any natural predators to take them out. So you're better off doing sterile mix. Now, the word sterile means that there's no pests overwintering in them. There's really no life in them. So that is an advantage here because thrips overwinter in our soils, in weeds and whatever else. So if something is sterile, there can't be any thrips in there. So I thought to myself, would it be possible to maximize the space of a small crate where I'm already fitting in anywhere from like, we'll call it 20 to 30 lily bulbs, depending on the size of the lily bulbs, and interplant snapdragons in between. And my initial fear was that the snapdragons would get outgrown by the lilies. I mean, you can see over here, lilies have pretty decent amount of foliage. And I was afraid that at a certain point, the lilies would outgrow and have so much foliage that it would outshade the snapdragon. What I found was that the snapdragon ended up coming out to the side. So you can see over here, when I planted these snapdragons in the crates, they were planted in between the rows of the lilies, and there was some on the exterior. And I found that all of them started stretching outwards. The good thing about interplanting snapdragons with the lilies is that there's no netting needed because the lilies are helping support the snaps. Now, there are a couple in here where maybe the stem's a little bit wonky, but for the most part, I'm getting better stems than if I were to grow these outside and netted them, because I usually only do one layer of netting, and by the time they get this tall, you really ideally need 2 layers of netting. So it worked out really well. I was surprised that these ended up stretching enough to basically get the light. Now, the downside is that the stems are a little bit on the thinner side. So still totally workable, but typically in a primary stem for a snapdragon, these would be a lot thicker. Sometimes they're so thick that it's kind of hard to use them in a bouquet. They're great for floristry sales, but there is still definitely a time and place for a stem like this. And I would argue that in a mixed bouquet, a stem like this actually does really, really well. The other downside is that the bloom heads are a little bit more petite. There's fewer florets. I think that's both a function of me not having fertilized them enough, but also the fact that these were obviously stretching. It wasn't like as much sunlight as they normally would have gotten, but still, I am pretty happy with this output. If you think about it, this one crate, I have, we'll call it 25 lilies in here. And then I actually have 20 snapdragons. So this one crate filled 45 plants, which makes it a very, very profitable crate. So totally offsets the cost of the sterile pro mix that I had to buy, and also really maximizes the amount of space that I had in here. I do want to show you another crate I had where I planted the snapdragons side by side. So meaning there were 2 rows of lily bulbs over here and then 2 rows of snapdragons. And as you can see, these snapdragons have way wonkier stems. I mean, this one is like growing sideways 5 ways. And these stems, even though I could use this in something like a mason jar vase, are basically unusable from a floristry perspective. So even though there's more space, more sunlight for these snapdragons, at the end of the day, if you were to just grow snapdragons in crates, you would need to figure out how to net them. That is the major takeaway, is that if you want to grow these in crates, you have to net them without any other supporting type of flower to intercrop with. Just to show you, here are a couple of other crates with snapdragons. So you can see I have quite a few blooming within 2 crates. This one has more florets. It's got really, really long stem length, and even though it is a little bit crooked down here, there's enough stem length where it would still be straight for florist sales. Now, I typically do not get such a long stem in the field. This is probably about 2.5 feet on average. I would say my stems in the field are 18 inches at their best, which is more than plenty for most uses. But of course, longer stem length is not a bad thing to have. Sorry for the sweaty look. I just finished working out, but if I don't finish recording this video, it's never gonna get finished recording. The good news though is that I was able to finish harvesting all of the rest of the stems in the crates that you saw, and this is what they look like. I think this looks really awesome. This is going to market floor tomorrow at my cooperative, and hopefully one of the florists will pick this up because it is the perfect color for wedding work. But I wanted to take some time to talk about this from a business standpoint and thinking about it strategically as to why it might make sense for you to try something like this. Now, one of the objectives I've had, even in my first year of flower farming, is hitting the shoulder seasons. Whether or not I was successful is a different story. But for those of you who don't know, the shoulder seasons are the early spring as well as late fall time of the year where there are few flowers. So we're talking about the time before your last frost as well as the time after your first frost in the fall. So obviously in the early spring, things are slow going. If you haven't invested in infrastructure like a greenhouse or a hoop house, you're probably not going to have flowers. So if you can have flowers then, like this, then you can actually charge a premium for that because there's not a lot of local availability. I think that if I had kept this indoors in my basement and grown it from January, I probably would have gotten blooms sometime in like late April, which is way earlier than what people would achieve here in hoop houses. Now let's actually talk about later fall, because what I found is that snapdragons are actually relatively cold hardy, including frost hardy. The problem is that we start losing day length, as well as sometimes the nights get so cold that if your snaps aren't at this point of just being able to bloom, they're really not going to bloom. And that's what happened to me when I had a fall succession, which was that I had a few stems that bloomed fine for me, but there were some that were just too far away from reaching maturity, and they never had the chance to finish blooming because it got too cold and there wasn't enough day length. So the point being here is that even if you have fall succession planted snaps and they are cold hardy, it does not guarantee you blooms. So one of the things that I'm going to try to do is actually get snaps in time for Thanksgiving, or basically hold off on them until Thanksgiving. We typically get our first killing frost sometime in like late October. Sometimes it's like mid-October, even early October. It depends. But the point is that if I grow these snaps in crates, I can grow them outside before that first frost hits and then bring them inside. And usually what always happens is that you get your first frost, but then the next week or so is okay. And then you start getting more consistent cold temperatures at night where it's too cold for these crates to be outside. So my goal is to still get lilies and snapdragons for Thanksgiving, and I'm gonna try to time both of them so that I plant them in the same crate and I'm able to move them indoors and achieve some blooms for Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is a time of year where, at least where I live, you typically don't see a lot of local flowers, but those who are able to still get local flowers because they have hoop houses are able to fetch a significant premium. Thanksgiving, believe it or not, is a really big floral holiday if you can hit it. Christmas is also a big floral holiday, but that is really testing the limits of doing something like this. So hopefully that gives you something to think about, to gnaw on. If the business side of things is something that really interests you, I actually have a free newsletter that goes out every single Wednesday. We discuss a bit about flower farming business. I also talk about something that's a little bit more timely or relevant. It could be related to like pests or something that I'm growing that's coming up and something that I've learned from. So I'm going to put the link in the description below, but hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next video.